Father Paul, can you start us off with a prayer?
So, loving Father, we have placed in your hands the names of people that we love. We ask that you touch our lives, but watch over all of us as we celebrate this wonderful feast day of the Society of Jesus. Bless us. Give us that wonderful spirit that St. Ignatius talked about, that love of the Lord that is so willing to go forth and share the Lord with others. So bring us peace, watch over us, bring us health, especially during this horrible pandemic. And we pray especially for all those that are in any way affected by it. And we offer this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Right. What I want to start out today is just as we celebrate today the feast of St. Ignatius. You know, time and again, I've been stressing to see the presence of the Spirit of the church. You know, is the gift of so many people. It's not serendipity. It's that Spirit of God leading the church, calling it into being each day, and realizing there always has to be moments of newness. You know, Jesus lives, and there has to be newness of life. So the wonder of St. Ignatius of Loyola and just how he came to be. He was a nobleman and a soldier and a womanizer. And he was in the army, and at the siege by the French of the Spanish city, he was wounded by a cannonball. This did not achieve his conversion. What it did was it set the stage for the conversion. Ignatius wanted to go back being a courtly dandy, but the cannonball had so smashed his leg that it left him with a horrible limp. And so Ignatius went through some surgeries. And remember, these surgeries are without anesthesia. Maybe 2 shots of whiskey to deaden the pain, but beyond that, he was conscious. But he so much wanted to return to his old way of life. So what happened is, it meant a long 18 months recovery at the castle of Loyola. And where the Spirit of God worked was, Ignatius was bored. He was bored silly. And so he asked for some books in the palace. And so he asked for some books in the palace. The only 2 books that he could find, or they had in the palace, remember, printing of books had just taken place maybe 20 years earlier. The only 2 books was the Life of Christ and the Life of Saints. And so Ignatius started to read them. And it was this pilgrimage as he read the books. So he wanted to be a great hero. And he began to think perhaps it would be nice to be a hero for Christ. But every once in a while, his daydreaming would go back to the courtly life and his desire to go back to that. But it's during this recovery, he begins to realize what's happening in his life. When he dreams of going back to the court, of being a womanizer and a dandy, after it's over, he begins to find there is desolation. He's unsettled. But when he dreams of serving the Lord, of really being a hero for Jesus Christ, he finds a real peace that is there. And this begins his introspection and understanding for him the discernment of spirits, that there are 2 spirits in our life. And what is important is to understand which spirit is calling us. And that's important because one of the things that I realize, especially in the confessional, many times when the Spirit intervenes into our life, the bad spirit, it comes under the guise of light. And that's what's so dangerous about that spirit. Can I give you a simple, very simple example? Somebody comes to me in confession and they say, Father, I really had a big fight with my wife. I'm really embarrassed. I said some very nasty things to her, and I need forgiveness. So for the past 2 Sundays, I've not gone to communion. You know, I just, this really was so bad. See, to me, that's not the good spirit. That's the evil spirit, leading us to stay away from the Eucharist. See, the Eucharist is not given to us because we've been good. The Eucharist is given to us because it's the way for Jesus to enter into our life. And so at this point, I told the man, this is the time, especially you go to the Eucharist. You need the Lord. And so Ignatius was a real master at discerning which spirit was calling us. And that was to be so important in his life. Okay, it took a long while. Ignatius spent, a year at Manresa. And he realized he made some mistakes. His penances sometimes were so terrible that it really injured his health. Then he went on and realized that he had to study. He was arrested by the Inquisition because here it was a layman preaching. So he went to Salamanca to study, then made his way to Paris, where he did his degree in theology. While at Paris, one of his roommates was Francis Xavier, a young man. You know, Ignatius was in his 30s, and Francis Xavier was around 21. They met, and Ignatius really began to have a tremendous effect on Xavier. And gradually he gathered a group that made a special vow to establish a community. They had one priest among the members, Peter Faber, who celebrated the Mass. And so they all decided to become and establish a religious community. Eventually, Ignatius made his way to Rome, where he requested permission from the Pope to establish this community. What was very funny is, and this was the gift of the Spirit, Ignatius realized that what the church needed was a community that could move fast. So he changed some of the rules that existed in every order, and that was living in community and chanting the Holy Office every day. He realized that what the church needed were people that could move. And so he established a community, and the Holy Office was not to be chanted in common. A lot of people had reservations about this society. So a lot of people don't realize initially Ignatius was to limit it to 90 people. Then it was lifted to 300 and then more. But it was met with a certain amount of suspicion. What is going on? It wasn't like other communities, but it was to be a great gift to the church. As Jesuits entered and they spread throughout the world, very quickly, Xavier was sent to India and China and Japan. The mission of the society. And then very quickly in Ignatius's life, we moved into the education of youth. It was a wonderful moment and a great gift to the church. And, that's the perspective of Ignatius. It was a community called to work on the frontiers, to go forth, to do new things. And that's always going to be something that scares people. We're called to the frontiers where other people have not been. And yet that's our ministry, is to be there and to work with Christ and to make known his work. So that's my little fervorino on this feast day of St. Ignatius. So now what I want to get into is our religious history thing. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on the medieval church, especially the papacy. Now, someone asked me about where I get this. If you can see, it is the Oxford Dictionary of the Popes. And it goes through all the popes. And if you ever read it and you go through it and you begin to say, probably one of the great miracles of the Lord is that the church has survived the papacy. And I mean that. When you look at some of the things that happened, you begin to say, oh my God, what a miracle of the Lord that the church has survived the papacy, because it is not always a pretty picture. And what I want to start with is Gregory VII, a saint, a wonderful pontiff. He reigned from 1073 to 1085, 12 years. Gregory was a great man and should be accorded to be a saint. One of his great fights was with Henry IV, the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor. See, there was a whole question is, what is the power of the emperor in the appointment and the power of bishops? See, in some areas, what was happening during the consecration of a bishop, the ordination of a bishop, the king or the emperor would present to the bishop his ring and his mitre, the symbols of authority. And many of them insisted that this was their power, and to remind the bishops that they are under them. Gregory was fighting this. He felt that the kings, the emperors, have no right to appoint bishops. That was the power given to him. And so this was the great fight between Henry IV and Gregory VII. And if you ever remember the story of the Pope at Canossa, as he forced Henry IV to his knees, and he really demanded that henceforward, that it was the Pope and the bishop presiding at the ordination who presented these items. This was a church power, not a civil power. Gregory was a great man. Unfortunately, one of his weaknesses was at times he didn't know how to compromise, to give in a little bit. And so while he blessed the church with his strength, he also left a lot of his followers a little bit weary of him. They felt that there could be a little bit more commendation with the kings and the rulers. And his actions really were to affect the next 100 years, because there began to be two groups in the church. One that really wanted to follow Gregory, and the main thrust of their pontificate would be maintaining the independence of the church from the state. So there was one group that were real followers of Gregory. There was another group that were really some good people. What they felt is the main thrust of their papacy would be the reform of the church, maintaining church discipline, bringing people to the gospel, correcting the abuses in the church. And so in the next 100 years, there are two principal groups of people that are vying for power. Both good people. You know, it's just not one is, sometimes we always see as good and evil. There were two groups that had a vision for the church, and they saw the place of the papacy as one way to carry it out. So one of the things I want to point out is, in the 100 years, Gregory dies in 1085. Up through 1188, 103 years, we have 14 legitimate popes. We also have 11 anti-popes. Now, what an anti-pope is someone that has been elected in opposition to the seated pope. And you have to be careful because it isn't always clear who is the pope and who is the anti-pope. But what you find is some of these popes that were anti-popes were wonderful holy men. They simply had a different vision of the church. And what they saw is the influence of Roman families that openly influenced the elections. I mean, you have stories, for instance, of there's an election going on. The cardinals are gathered, and they have unanimously elected a pope. What happened is agents, soldiers of one of the families in Rome, they had their own personal army. They raided the consistory and took it over. They came in with spears and axes and threatened the Pope. The one man that had been elected was badly beaten up, and he dies 3 days later from his injuries. And they forced the cardinals to elect another Pope. And so what happens is the man that was elected unanimously is badly beaten up. He realizes for peace sake, so he does resign under threat of death. He resigns the papacy, and they go to elect a new man. Okay. There's a group of cardinals that pull out and say, wait a second, that the second pope was not exactly elected according to Hoyle. So they then went off and elected a third pope that actually demanded the allegiance of a great deal of people. So what you have is in the church is two men, both good men. This is, sometimes it's nice, easy to simplify, one is bad and one is good. These are two good men that love the church, that love the Lord. And what they see is the real problems in the church. See, so often what you had is questions of absentee bishops. I shared with you, for instance, that the husband of Isabel, Ferdinand, had 2 daughters legitimately. He had at least 4 sons illegitimately. All right. He wanted to somehow help them out, to give them some income. They couldn't inherit the royal, they were illegitimate. They couldn't inherit the royal fortune. So what happened is with one is he was a young man. I think he was 19 years old, if I remember right. And Ferdinand makes him Archbishop of Saragossa. As Archbishop, there was a wonderful palace next to the cathedral where he could live, and there was a wonderful income from this archdiocese. So he becomes the Archbishop of Saragossa. I read somewhere that in his lifetime, he celebrated Mass 5 times. But, he had a nice, comfortable life as Archbishop of Saragossa, and he appointed some peons to run the church in his name. He had a mistress, more than one actually, but one of his sons became Alphonsus II, Archbishop of Saragossa. And he didn't exactly live up to his vows of celibacy because he had a daughter, at least one daughter. And this daughter was to marry the Duke of Candia. And out of it was to come one of our Jesuit saints, Francis Borgia. Francis Borgia there's a book about him called The Rose Among the Thorns, because Francis Borgia, one of our Jesuit saints, he was the 3rd Jesuit general. As I say, on his mother's side, his great-great-grandfather was Ferdinand the Catholic. On his father's side, his great-great-grandfather was Alexander IV, the Pope, and the Borgia Pope. And so Francis Borgia emerged as a wonderful saintly man, but his history, his genealogy is wonderful. And this is one of the problems that is going to be seen throughout the church, is nobles finding place for their sons in the church by making them bishops and cardinals, archbishops, where they would inherit the wealth of the church, and they could lead a very, very good life. In fact, later on, what you have is you have two outstanding in the sense they were well-known cardinals, Richelieu and Mazarin in France. Both became the prime ministers of the kings of France. What they were is two very ambitious people, where they realized they were commoners. And basically, to break through the glass ceiling of a commoner to a nobleman was all but impossible. The only way that you could do it was via the church. So both Richelieu and Mazarin were ordained priests, consecrated bishops, and became cardinals. As cardinals, they were princes of the church. And in a Catholic country like France and England earlier, they were equal to members of the royal family. They were princes of the church and had a special vocation. So that was the only way a commoner could really reach out to nobility, was through the avenue of the church. And all of this is going to be part of the problem the church will be facing as it faces the Reformation. As I say, there are all kinds of difficulties. When you read in this book, for instance, at least 2 or 3 times, the conclaves are held up for 18 months at one time, 28 months for another. There is no pope. And mainly because of the pressure of families and trying to get that 2/3 majority. So at least twice that I could study in my books, there is no pope for a good number of years. And of course, gradually the cardinals are dying out. And there is real force to bring about a pontificate. Then there's a further problem in Rome. Rome develops a commune that stands in opposition to the Pope. They want to be the leaders of the city. And so you have a tremendous contrast during this time and afterwards, as the popes have to work with this commune. What you find is there are 3 popes in a row that never actually live in Rome. They are elected first at Perugia, secondly at Pisa, and they're never allowed to go to Rome. And so one of the things is, if you see this, what was happening, the times the popes are driven out of Rome, it wasn't any surprise that you find when the Pope moves to Avignon in France. He's a Frenchman. And by this time, Rome is falling apart as a city. You know, at the time of imperial Rome, it was a city of a couple of million. It was a beautiful, gorgeous city. But by the time you find the 1300s, Rome was falling apart. There are swamps around Rome that were the source of tremendous mosquitoes and tremendous amount of illness because of it. In the summer, it was hot and humid. Living in Rome was a hell. And so what you find is the popes make a move to Avignon. If you've ever been to southern France in Avignon, it's a gorgeous city on the Rhone River, a wonderful place. The Pope builds a wonderful palace, and he is the Holy Father, remaining title Bishop of Rome, which is going to be the anomaly and the difficulty. And so what you find is that the popes are in Avignon, very much under the control of the French king. And they're not bad people. The whole period is badmouthed by the Italian cardinals. The Italian cardinals resent the fact that it's no longer in Italy, their home, that it's in France. And so if you read some of their works, it sounds like the popes were horrible, that they did no good. Yet, what you find, for instance, is during a couple of the plagues, you find two of the popes who are at Avignon really go out of their way to rescue Jews, to give them support. Many times the Jews were the victims of pogroms because they were blamed for the plague. And two of the popes really go out of their way to support the Jews and to prevent some of the mob rule which was attacking the Jewish communities. And so they're not bad people. And they were Frenchmen, they loved France, and they wanted to stay there. The woman that was so much responsible for bringing the popes back to Rome was Catherine of Siena. Catherine of Siena was a lay woman. She'd be similar to, she was a third order Dominican. If any of you are third order Carmelites, we have a large group that gather at our church. They're lay people that try to lead a special life. And so she's not a religious woman in the sense she's a cloistered sister. She lives at home, but has made vows as a Dominican tertiary. It's wonderful what she does. She brings the Pope back to Rome. And let me tell you, if you ever read her works, you know, some of them have to be excavated. I mean, she's a woman who didn't mince words at all. In some of her better days, she called the Pope Daddy-o. And, you know, it was just, she's a wonderful, wonderful woman who dies very young. She brings the Pope back, and shortly after that, she dies. And so often in the Roman way of doing things, her head is buried in Siena. Her body is buried in Rome at the Church of St. Maria Supra Minerva. It's a Dominican church. You know, they have a way of trying to spread out all the bones and bodies so that they have the relics. But Catherine of Siena was a wonderful woman who brings the papacy back. The Pope returns to Rome and within weeks dies. So now you have a conclave is called to elect the new Pope. Okay, as a conclave gathers, you know, you don't have yet the Sistine Chapel. So if they gather at the Vatican to elect a new Pope, a substantial mob gathers outside of the conclave. And this mob shouting death, unless there is an Italian Pope. So what you have is you have this mob yelling insults, threatens. So the cardinals do elect an Italian as the Pope. Not a good choice. The man really had mental problems. You know, he had a mental problems. He really had an inferiority complex and a real persecution complex. If ever you were talking with someone in subdued terms, and as he came by, you shut up, he figured that they were talking about him. And he was really afraid of this. And he'd have people arrested on just this basis, that you know, you were inciting disobedience against him. So what happened is the French cardinals really feel threatened. So what they do is they all, as a group, pull out of Rome. They pull out of Rome and they declare the election of the Pope null and void, that it was done under duress and therefore not a legitimate election. So they pulled out and they elected one of their members a Frenchman. So now what starts is the Great Western Schism, where you have two popes, and two popes that divide the church. Now, in the listing of popes, the church has never made an official statement on who is the valid pope. They simply will list both men. And what you find is, you find saints on both sides. You find wonderful people on both sides. The French Pope tends to be much more in France and England. Germany and Italy follow the Roman Pope. And so you follow about 40 or 50 years of the Great Western Schism. Eventually, you have a third Pope. You have some reformers who decide, okay, what they're going to do is they'll depose the other two and elect a third. Well, that just complicates the whole matter. They have gathered at Pisa. So finally, actually, the emperor intervenes. He gets the Roman Pope, he gets the Pisa Pope to resign, the Roman Pope to resign, and the French Pope simply escapes to Spain, where he's going to die. He never resigns. But basically, the church accepts one Pope who lives in Rome. And this brings the end to the Great Western Schism. But it did irreparable damage to the church. It really did. I mean, it just, the pettiness, the infighting, the insults. For the church to, there's a great deal of healing that has to take place. Okay, I'd like people to be unmuted so that any questions on this up to this point, any questions? I can't see everybody.
Go ahead.
Father,
Yes.
what would be a great book to read about St. Ignatius and St. Catherine?
Okay. There's a number of works of St. Ignatius. St. Catherine, there's a number of works also. I wouldn't be able to give you the actual name of any of them. What I can do is, I can look it up and have it put on the website. Some biographies of Ignatius and Catherine of Siena.
Father Paul, we're actually going to be publishing a newsletter next month. And why don't we put those titles in the newsletter as a follow-up for your lectures?
Okay, because see, one of the things that I'm not always going to be able to answer your questions today. Part of the method of an historian is where to look it up. And so I'm just drawing a blank on actually some of the histories of Ignatius. But one of the men that's a wonderful historian and a Jesuit is I'm drawing a blank on a name. I'll make sure in the newsletter we have some names and titles. Okay? Anyone else?
I have a question, Father. What was the basis of Catherine of Siena's argument? What was so powerful about her argument that occasioned this big move?
Well, her main movement was that you're the Bishop of Rome. What are you doing up in Avignon? And this idea, you should be residents in your diocese. And see, that fit in with a lot of the rules in the church. The bishop was supposed to be residents in your diocese. For instance, there's rules that a bishop can only be outside his diocese for 30 days in a year. Okay, if this is a rule for bishops, what is happening with the Pope of Rome? He's gone from his diocese more than 30 days. She was just a very strong personality. And she just had her way. Does that answer your question?
I was wondering if she had used any of the issues like with Peter having gone there and having died there and
Yeah.
being buried there. And, you know, I don't know. I was just wondering if that was in the mix.
Oh, yeah. It was the whole idea. This is where Peter died. You were the bishop of this city. Now, one thing, we grew up very often hearing that the Pope was the vicar of Christ. You probably have heard that quite often. That only shows up in the 1400s, where the popes began to adopt the name vicar of Christ. What happened is they are the vicar of Peter. That was the earlier terminology they used for the popes, that the Pope was the vicar of Peter. Now, gradually, as they want to assume more and more power, they adopt the term with some popes, as the vicar of Christ, that somehow they are called in a special way to be between God and people.
Father Paul, in the last few weeks, we have talked about why priests would become celibate. And one of the points you made was that the church did not want church property to pass out of the church holdings, where if a priest were married, the church property would pass to the wife.
Yes.
Can we talk about that idea in reference to Ferdinand, okay, and appointing his son the Archbishop of Zaragoza, and then the son appointing his son the Archbishop of, okay. How does that correlate?
All right. What you have is some rules were just ignored.
Gotcha.
This was, he's king. He's king. And it's the ability to say, these rules don't apply to me. And now remember, in celibacy, religious communities, and like the Benedictines, always demanded celibacy, chastity on the part of their priests and brothers. It was the idea of the local clergy. So remember, in the church, there are two levels of clergy. You have the clergy that are diocesan. And then you have, and they are called the secular clergy, the diocesan clergy. Then you have the religious communities. And with the religious communities, you have the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Okay. The diocesan clergy does not take a vow of poverty. They can own property, they can have their own wealth. They make a promise of obedience to their local bishop. And then today, they have a promise of celibacy. They do not get married. But even today, for instance, that rule can be lifted. As the church has allowed primarily Episcopalian priests and Lutheran ministers to come into the church, many of them are already married, and the church has allowed them to be ordained in the Roman Catholic Church as married priests. I think one of the parishes in Oakland, outside of Oakland, Walnut Creek, has a priest who has a family. He's married. And he is the parish priest in that parish. Now, one of the things that I've noticed is in the Eastern Rite churches, the Orthodox churches, a married man is never called to be a bishop. All bishops are called from the local priests who have decided to maintain celibacy, or monks. So in the election of bishops in the Eastern Church, married men are not called to the bishopric. That is all monks. And those priests in the community that have chosen celibacy as their way of life. For instance, I helped out in a wedding at an Armenian Orthodox church about 3 blocks from here. And what you find is the pastor, the priest, has chosen the path of celibacy. In their rule, you have to be married before you are ordained. There is a deacon in the parish who is married already. And so right now he's a deacon, and someday he will be advanced to the priesthood. But you have to be married in the Eastern Church before you are ordained.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Father Paul? Okay.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Father, if you saw that Scorsese movie, The Silence, talking about the Jesuits working at the margins,
Yes.
if you saw it, could you share your reflections on it?
Okay. Let's stick, that would be something, might be a good talk later on. I'm not prepared right now to talk on that.
Sure.
It's a good question, but as I say, we're trying to talk, for instance, on the possibility of some classes in October, which I would do. That might be a very, very good subject for one of the classes. But I would just find that today I wouldn't be prepared to say much on that.
Okay, thanks anyway.
Yes. Any other questions? All right. Let's be muted again, and I want to spend a few minutes on Protestant Reformation. There was a great deal of difficulties in the church. It had lost the respect of so many people. What went on, for instance, with the Archbishop of Saragossa was rife throughout the church. So many places you had absentee bishops. I wanted to point out, for instance, Cardinal Wolsey of England, who was the Chancellor of England. He was the papal legate, which gave him a stipend. He was the Archbishop of York, the second most important archdiocese in England. He also had himself appointed the bishop of a number of other dioceses and abbot of a number of monasteries of men and prior of a number of monasteries of women, all of which gave him a stipend. That made him the wealthiest man in England. His personal wealth was enormous. As I said before, he built Hampton Court Palace. And if you ever visit Hampton Court Palace, what it is for the first time, this is not a castle. It's built out in the country, but it is not a castle. It's an indication of the peace that had been brought by the Tudor monarchy. It was not a fortress. It was a palatial mansion, more than a palatial mansion in the countryside. Eventually, Wolsey, who was not a stupid man, realized that the king was a little bit jealous of his wealth and of Hampton Court. So he gave it to the king. He presented the king as a gift. And it became a royal palace for a number of years. But Wolsey was typical. He did not arrive in the territory of his Archdiocese of York until, 3 days before he died. That was that was typical of the weakness that was happening throughout the church. He was not alone in what he was doing. So what you have is the beginning of the Reformation. Now, when you talk about the Reformation, it's not just religious. There are economic, business, nationalism are all rife in what happens in the Protestant Reformation. Now, what is happening is St. Peter's, which had been built by Constantine, is falling apart. The Pope wants to rebuild St. Peter's. And so that's his call, is to rebuild St. Peter's. So he starts calling for, among other things, an indulgence to be preached. In other words, to go around and an indulgence will be preached where people will donate money to eventually build the present St. Peter's that we have. And remember, St. Peter's took some 200 years to build. It wasn't all built in one day. Okay. Now, I'm limiting to certain things. One of the problems that they met in Germany was Albrecht of Mainz had become the archbishop there. He had paid off curia cardinals to have his name placed in nomination. Okay, the agreement was, and what he had done is, he had borrowed money from the Fugger Bank, a major German bank at that time, to pay off the curia in Rome. Now, what happened is, Albert expected that Mainz, he'd be able to return the loan depending on the income of the Archdiocese of Mainz. There was a depression or a recession, whichever word you want to say. The income dropped heavily. Albert couldn't pay his debt from the bank. And the bank was not beyond twisting a few arms or breaking a few arms and legs to get the money back. All right, Albert had friends in Rome. So an agreement was made that out of the indulgence, the bank could take its share to pay back the loan. So one of the difficulties about Tetzel, he was a Dominican friar, but not what you would call the greatest friar in the world. We know he had at least 3 children. So Tetzel is preaching this. And what Tetzel is preaching is, I would say, is pure heresy. What Tetzel is saying is, all you have to do is give your money. You'll get this certificate of forgiveness. Then you can go out and sin anytime you wish, and you don't worry. You can suddenly apply this special card. You have this bonus. You can do what you wish. Well, that's pure heresy. It's pure, absolute heresy. That's one point that's happening. Secondly is, at this time, there was a big market in relics. And a market in relics so much that constantly graves were being raided so that people could create relics to sell. So you would raid a cemetery, pick up the bones, and start creating artificial relics that went on sale. This is big business. Okay, the local count had a big collection of relics in his palace. And coming up on All Saints' Day, all these relics would be out for view. And of course, you paid a little sum of money. You paid an entrance fee to see them. Okay. This was the 2 events led Martin Luther to write his famous theses, which he nailed to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. Now, today, if I can say this, there's been a Lutheran Catholic dialogue that's been going on. And what this Lutheran Catholic dialogue is, They did an exhaustive study of all the statements by Luther and his followers and the Roman Catholic Church. And what they all suddenly agreed is that basically both sides were saying the same thing. I mean, this is the pathetic thing of what happened. Both sides were saying basically the same thing, except one side was emphasizing one aspect, the other church was another aspect. But they really didn't disagree on the essentials. They both were saying the same thing. Unfortunately, what is happening is fear, anger. Neither side is listening to each other. There's all kinds of anger, and this leads to the split with the church. That's the sad thing, is the whole thing was a major misunderstanding. Now, England, Henry VIII. Henry VIII, and you know, this much to be said about him. Henry VIII, the only child that survives is a daughter. Henry VIII is probably really upset whether she can succeed. It's probably a real fear of his that a woman to become Queen of England. Every time someone else had attempted as a woman to be queen, they were killed. Henry VIII is really afraid for his legacy. Okay, he's fallen out of love for his wife, Catherine of Aragon. She is Spanish. She is a daughter of Ferdinand the Catholic. And it happens to be her nephew. Her sister Joan's son is King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor. That's an important fact to remember. Okay, Henry has sought out an annulment or divorce in his marriage. Now, there is evidence. The Pope had granted divorces in about 25 cases. They usually were nobility, significant people. And up to this time, the Pope had actually, on a number of definite cases, had granted a divorce. See, one of the things is, don't read back our present legislation on marriage and divorce back to Henry VIII. Much of that law and legislation comes out of Trent. Trent follows the Protestant Reformation. That's when the church got together and really, it's a long council where the church really began to write out the decrees and the statutes. So it wasn't impossible for Henry VIII to get his divorce. It had been granted before. However, what was happening is Charles occupied Rome. His army had invaded Rome. And for instance, if you ever visit Rome and you go through the Raphael suites in the Papal Palace, you see where it was shot up at times. And there's still evidence of bullet damage to these wonderful rooms. Charles occupies Rome. And remember, there wasn't this respect to the Pope. The Pope was his enemy and his prisoner. And he didn't always treat the Pope well. He was a Catholic, but he saw the Pope, you know, as another ruler. So Charles, of course, hears about this. And basically he tells the Pope, I would not grant the divorce. And so the Pope is very much afraid of what Charles could do to him. So he rejects the divorce. And this, of course, is going to lead to the separation in England, where Henry pulls out of the Roman Church. Okay, that's my topic for today. Any questions on this second half? So if we can be unmuted, I will take questions. Mary? Do you have a question?
Terry. Did you say Terry?
No, anybody, just speak up.
Terry's good.
Okay. A couple weeks ago, oh, okay. Are you talking to me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. A couple weeks ago, you talked about the heresy of declaring that Mary was the mother of God. And I didn't quite get what you had, the outcome that you had said about that. Could you clear that up a little bit?
Okay. Arius basically said Jesus was a wonderful man, but human. So the term that was used is Mary was the Christotokos, the bearer of Christ. Now, that's fine. For them, it meant Christ was not divine. So at Ephesus, what they did is they defined Mary as the Theotokos, the bearer of God. And that which opened up our term, Mary, the mother of God. So they didn't, at the council, they didn't say mother of God. They said the bearer of God. But this term came out, and from now on, Mary was known as the mother of God. Does that answer your question?
So it is heresy that, I mean, nobody can be the mother of God. God was, and he created us all. So what I'm saying is the Catholic Church believe that he is the mother of God, or just the mother of Jesus, man that came down to earth?
Yeah, but it's the God man. It's the Jesus is the Word of God, is the God man. And so he chose to become incarnate in her womb. So Jesus is not a human being, he's a divine being. And Mary is the bearer of a divine being. So the title they gave is Mary is the Mother of God.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, I mean, Jesus, fine. God is no beginning. The Trinity is no beginning. But Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, decided to come into our world. And so he took on flesh in the womb of Mary. And so that becomes, Jesus is God and Mary is his mother. And so that's the term they use, Mary is the mother of God.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anyone else?
I have a question again. When I lived in Texas, there was an Episcopalian priest who was actually on his second marriage. His first wife had died, and he had 4 children by her. And as an Episcopal priest, he met another woman and married her, but was allowed to still be ordained in the Roman Catholic Church.
Yes.
And where he served
Now,
then, I believe he served.
Can you be very careful in your chronology? His wife died.
His first wife died.
Okay, his first wife died. And then he remarried as an Episcopalian.
Yes, as an Episcopalian priest.
Yes.
And so he was on his second marriage with 4 children from the first marriage,
Okay.
was then accepted into the Roman Church
Yes.
and ordained as a Roman Catholic priest,
Yes.
where he served in the hospital ministry.
Okay.
What do you see as the primary objections to other, to I guess the married priesthood in general, I never asked him if he had to sign anything, or what the, legal aspects of his taking on this role. But I'm just wondering, what are the primary objections, and could not they be handled in other ways that are available to us today? I'm just wondering.
I'm not sure.
Because we've used a lot of this thing that Jesus had only men and all that, but a lot of his apostles were married.
I know. All right. You're asking my opinion. And I think this is what you're asking is there any reason why we can't have a married clergy today in general?
Yes.
Okay, number one, that does not apply to the religious communities. It's not going to apply to people like the Jesuits, the Dominicans. We take a vow of chastity to live in community. So it's not going to apply to us. Now, what you're talking about is the diocesan clergy. They don't take the vows of the religious. Now, should they be allowed to be married? Okay, that's the question. Now, one of the things that's happening that's very relevant to it is there was a synod on the Amazon where there is a tremendous shortage of priests. One of the things that came out of this synod was that the local church, where it needed, could allow optional celibacy. That was one of the decisions that came out. It has not been ratified by Francis yet, but probably will be. And so what it does, it basically says that local churches, seeing their need, can allow optional celibacy. And what they suggested is that people who are married, who are older, can be ordained for service of the church. It hasn't been approved yet. If you ask my opinion, I have no problem with it.
Father, isn't there priest from, say, Episcopal priest or priest before a priest of a different rite? They are married. In other words, if they're Byzantine and they are married and they come with a wife and kids, they are accepted into the Roman Catholic Church, even though they are, in fact, married.
Yes, I know.
There's no opposition to that.
Yes. Now they can't remarry. See, that's true. Example: when I grew up in Massachusetts, we had a small Armenian community in the area, and there was one man that had the United States would not allow people of the Eastern Rite who were in union with Rome to be married. The bishops had said no. So what this young man had done is, in the 30s, he went to Lebanon, where he did his theology, got married, and was ordained. But I remember this was in the 50s. He would come back to visit his parents. He was a priest, and he'd come back with his wife, and he would celebrate Mass at our parish church. And I do remember that. And it was all legal. And yes, Eastern Rite priests now, for a long time in Canada and the United States, they could not be married. That was a rule just for the United States and Canada. That's been changed. They can now be married, but they got to be married before they were ordained.
Well, I'm talking primarily about the Byzantine Church. I know there are some restrictions. You cannot be married and become a bishop.
Yeah.
You can be married once, but you cannot be married twice. We had we say Anglican priest that became Roman Catholic. He had a wife and a bunch of kids when I was living in Germany, and he was treated just like every other priest. In other
Okay.
words, there was no restriction on him whatsoever.
No, he's a priest. He's a priest. Except that, you know, it generally, most of the parish priests in Germany and the United States would not be married, but he was a holy priest.
Okay.
And the only, in fact, even now, for instance, in the Roman Church, what has happened is there are what we call, I think it's vicariates, where Episcopal priests get together. In the United States, they've never allowed an Episcopal married priest to be a bishop. Where there is an Episcopalian priest who was never married, has been allowed to become a bishop. Now, one of the things where the church has relaxed its rules, the same rules for the priesthood apply for the deacon. You know, like Eddie Gutierrez is a deacon. He's ordained. Okay. If you are not married at the time of your ordination, you take also a vow of celibacy. You have to be married before you are ordained. And generally, that vow of celibacy will occur if your wife dies. However, there's been one exception, and I know one in particular, where a deacon had young children. He applied for a dispensation, and the church allowed him to be remarried because of the young children. So I'm wondering, for instance, and this is, I'm surmising, I'm beginning to think if a man had was an Episcopalian priest, had become a Catholic priest and had children, and his wife died suddenly, I am wondering as if the church, like they would have done with deacons, would they give him permission to marry again?
Well, Paul, that's a fascinating question that I think we're going to have to look to for in the future.
Yep.
Are there any other questions? Paul, I want to thank you for the last 5 lectures. It has been fascinating and insightful and just so wonderful to listen to and come together to hear you. You are a terrific historian. I wish I'd taken history from you when I was in college. Okay. Everybody, thank you for joining us. In August, we resume our traditional schedule. Our next meeting is going to be August 21st. And Don Crean is going to be giving us a tour of the church. So it should be really, really interesting. Again, a big round of applause for Father Paul. Okay, you don't have to unmute, just let him see that you're applauding, okay?
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
thank you. And as I say, when we look at this history of the church, I think that one of God's great miracles is we've survived.
Probably so, yes. Thank you. And we'll look forward to the next series of lectures as well.
Okay, thank you. So send your suggestions for topics to Barbara, etc. You know, be happy to hear what people want to have discussed. And I'll do my best if I can.
Thank you so much.
God bless. Have a good day.
Thank you.
The age of miracles is not over.
That's right. Yeah, miracles do happen.